Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Robert Bosch Foundation in Berlin. It's great to see so many interested in transatlantic relations here today, celebrating with us this evening the launch of the Brookings Robert Bosch Foundation's Transatlantic Initiative. The Robert Bosch Foundation and Brookings started cooperating already some years ago, 2013. And it started with a senior fellow of the Robert Bosch Foundation at Brookings Institution, Constanze Stetzenmüller, who is present today. And today we presented the next Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at Brookings, Amanda Sloat, who is also present today. Brookings and Robert Bosch start this new initiative at a time where the relevance of the transatlantic relations on both sides of the pond is more and more being doubted. There's a number of Europeans who even think the relations could get worse, could not get worse. But you know the difference between a pessimist and an optimist? The pessimist said it can't get worse, and the optimist said yes, it can. But we are optimists that we can do something to improve these relations by cooperating and bringing together experts. We are, as I said already today, old-fashioned. We believe in facts. We believe in thorough research. We believe in honesty. And that is the stable basis of our cooperation. Therefore, today's panel on the German elections and the future of the transatlantic relations could not be more timely. A special thank and welcome to our partners from Brookings, who traveled very far to be with us today. Thank you for coming. And I'm giving now the floor to Bruce Jones, Vice President of the Brookings Institution. Thank you for coming. Have a nice evening. Bruce, yes, please.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Rogal. It's a pleasure to be here with you and all of your colleagues. I'm delighted to join you in the launch of the Brookings Bosch Transatlantic Initiative, and it's a pleasure to be here with so many friends and colleagues and members of the transatlantic community. As you mentioned, I think our two institutions are launching this initiative at a time of deep uncertainty and genuine questions and anxiety on both sides of the transatlantic partnership about the nature of the relationship and more broadly about the nature of the moment in international order in which we find ourselves, an order that has shaped our politics and foreign policy and yours for several decades, and now there are genuine questions on both sides of the Atlantic about that order, and more importantly, key challenges. To my mind, there are three. We're facing a very violent, active disordering and reordering of relations within states, between states, and among transnational actors in the wider Middle East, with obvious and serious ramifications for the world beyond. We're facing a very active, so far not yet violent, except for in Ukraine, looking at Kurt, but dangerous reordering of relations among the major economic and military powers on the world stage. And we're facing at the same time a very active reordering of political and economic relations within countries of the West as we grapple with new approaches and new challenges of globalization, of migration, of refugees. And I think all of these will be amplified in the coming years by the increasing penetration of technologies that will transform the challenges and opportunities for our security, for our defense, for our economies, and for our politics. And as we've seen, there are forces on both sides of the Atlantic that want to push forward, adapt, refine, but promote a stable order, and others who want to shift to a more atavistic and nationalist mood. And that's, I think, the context in which we have to think about US and Germany and US and Europe in the current moment. Those are separate challenges, but they're interrelated. For example, in the way that Syria has become an opportunity for the powers to engage in an old form of conflict, namely proxy warfare, with huge cost and huge violence to the local population. But also in the way in which a moment of doubt in the West is amplifying the risks of the rebalancing of international politics and power that is underway in at least economic terms, and increasingly in political and security terms as well. I think we both have a huge stake in each other's futures. If problems in Europe deepen, it will shift away from cooperation towards isolationism, nationalism, anti-Americanism, which I think are hugely damning to our national interests. If the American mood continues to sour, it will lead to a deeper retrenchment and go-it-aloneism, which is, I think, profoundly not in America's interests. If we fail to cooperate on these wider challenges, I think we will be both worse off. So there is a pressing need for dialogue, for research, and above all for new ideas on how to sustain and how to adapt the transatlantic relationship in the new context. I'll state briefly that I'm among those who believe that it's essential to international stability, but also that it needs to adapt, and that we should increasingly be thinking about a US, Europe, and others about who can tackle the challenges we have in front of us. And the agenda, in my mind, is to understand who that coalition is and how can we best structure burden sharing and multilateral cooperation to advance the goals that we share. So it's an incredibly important time, and we're very excited to join forces with you to tackle these challenges. In think tank world and in foundation world, it's common to use the word that something is transformative, but usually we don't mean it. In this context, I genuinely mean it. The expanding partnership with Robert Bosch Stiftung has been transformative for Brookings' work in this space. As you already mentioned, we're delighted to be able to add Amanda Slout to our team, who joins as the second Robert Bosch Senior Fellow, with huge experience in managing US and Europe relations, in particular over the last period of time dealing with Southern Europe, and a great addition to our partnership and to the space already occupied by Constanze. But in addition, this new opportunity has allowed us to widen our bench of talent and attract in new support and interest. And that bench now includes Victoria Newland, who you all know, Céline Bellin from France, Jamie Kirchik, who's here, Alina Polyakova, who will join us, and in November also Strobe Talbot, as he transitions away from being president of Brookings, will join this team because he was excited by the notion of an effort to reinforce the political West and the transatlantic relationship that so defined his career. I regret that one key member of our team is not with us today, namely Tom Wright, who leads our Europe work, but he has a pretty good excuse in that his wife gave birth last night. So the first product of the Bosch Brookings Fellowship. On the other hand, I'm very pleased that somebody who's not a core part of our Europe team per se, but is an essential part of a second element of the initiative, which is a new Brookings-Bosch Transnational Initiative Fellows program as part of the Robert Bosch Academy, and the inaugural holder of that position is Ted Picone, who's here today with us and is going to be spending several months in Berlin doing research on human rights, democracy, and international order as the inaugural holder of the BBTI Fellowship as part of Robert Bosch Academy. And collectively, this is a team which brings substantial policy, practical, and research experience to bear, and I think can make a vital contribution to the debate. So I want to end by underscoring our huge appreciation to our colleagues at the Bosch Stiftung. Joachim, you, of course, with Michaela, you, of course, Christian, and many, many others who have made this possible, and we're enormously grateful for the opportunity and excited by the challenge. And with that, Constanze, over to you.
Here. All right, good evening. My name is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I'm the said first Bosch Fellow. I have been agitating for a title change to Super Bosch Fellow to maintain the appropriate, distance from Amanda, but I'm not sure I'm getting anywhere with this. But I will say, beyond jokery, though, that I am very sincere when I say I'm delighted and honored to be a Bosch Fellow at Brookings, because quite literally the last 3 years that I've spent at Bosch, as a Bosch Fellow at Brookings have changed my life. This also happens to coincide with one of the most exciting phases of transatlantic relations, from Ukraine crisis to the refugee crisis. And then, of course, the American elections and our elections and a variety of other European elections. It's been a roller coaster ride, and I'm sure that I see many familiar faces in the audience for whom it has been a roller coaster ride as well, including several members of the Bundestag, who I'm happy to see re-elected. But we have a topic at hand that couldn't be more timely, and I have a panel here that couldn't be better. I'm going to not make lengthy introductions. We have Jürgen Hart on my extreme right, only in seating, not in any other way, who is the transatlantic coordinator of the German government, and well-liked as in this function, is in Washington frequently. Ken Logsdon, the chargé d'affaires at the American embassy here, and we all know that to be a chargé these days is a little different than it used to be. It carries, a really, truly weighty responsibility, and sometimes one does not have talking points when one would like to have them. So kudos to you for carrying such a weight of the relationship on your shoulders these days. We have Kurt, who also is carrying multiple weights on his shoulders. He runs the McCain Institute at the University of Arizona, named after Senator McCain, also an increasingly prominent figure in the relationship. And he's
somewhat to your left.
True. But now you've given that away. Thank you. And only in seating, somewhat to my left. So true. Thanks for reminding me. And he is also, in his free time, as it were, the Ukraine envoy. Is that the actual title, or is it
special representative for Ukraine
negotiations? There you are. And you should tell us a little more about where that is right now. And finally, we have Jan Techau, who is, I think his official or unofficial title is something of a gadfly in transatlantic relations, and certainly in Berlin. Jan knows how to provoke and likes to do it. The only one equal to Jan is my sadly former colleague Jeremy Shapiro, who abandoned us for the ECFR. We were trying to chain him up in the basement, but that didn't work out. So, but that's, and I'm in that sense very happy to have you here, still with the Holbrooke Forum at the American Academy, but also about to transition to the German Marshall Fund in January, right?
Exactly.
Have I just said something that wasn't public yet?
Well, you can't be beaten in terms of provocation.
God. All right, I think that's the second time I've done that this week. Yes.
Get the scoop.
All right. We are going to talk here today, of course, about transatlantic relations, the German election, and the future of the transatlantic relationship, paradigm shift or business as usual. Yeah. But before we go into the topic itself, I have some housekeeping notes I've been asked to tell you. We are going to be discussing among ourselves for an hour, and there will be a live stream of this. During this live stream, we will be followed by social media. And in fact, a group of Bosch alumni in Washington will be watching this at a live stream event and will also be sending us questions. The Bosch Fellows are a pretty impressive roster, particularly the alumni, which date back how many years? Bosch alumni, the Bosch Fellowship? 33?
33 years.
Yeah. Well, and believe me, they are quite a network. And we will also, in the Q&A after that, which will last 30 minutes, be getting some questions from them, which Franziska Bauer over there will be reading to me. I am also supposed to tell you that Tom Wright, who is not here because of said baby, which, by the way, is an extremely beautiful and very large baby, that's not the only thing he produced, and at somewhat shorter notice, because he also wrote the essay that's lying out there printed for you, A Post-American Europe. We should maybe discuss whether those terms are accurate. But he also produced that in somewhat shorter time and at shorter notice, and he was the one who actually gave birth to it. So he has a double paternity to be proud of. And I think I have a note here that says Anmeldung zum Newsletter. I think you can sign up for the newsletter of BBTI. This is legally complicated, so please, I think it means you say yes twice or something. Please do it. You will get our newsletter and links to our publications. I am very grateful that I got this in writing, because I would never have remembered all that. This is one of Bosch's legendary TikToks, as we call them in America, the Ablaufplan. I will say that it has one tiny mistake. Standards are lowering. It says here, for the people who manage the podium, Wasserflaschen auf dem Podium öffnen. Oh. And I see that the bottles are closed. So we'll have to do that ourselves, but I think we can manage. And with that, I'm going to move us into discussion.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Jürgen Hart, I'm going to ask you the first question. We're all aware of the Transatlantic Manifesto that was published a couple of days ago, one of the signatures being our dear friend who recently left us, Silke Tempel, another signatory sitting here in the form of Jan Techau, which got a somewhat passionate answer in Die Zeit this week by two Zeit authors. So this is a topic on everybody's minds right now. And I would like to ask you about something that I think picks up where the manifesto's left off. And I know that it isn't an easy question to ask you, but what needs to change? And what needs to change now in transatlantic relations for this relationship to survive?
First, I would like to say that this manifesto and all the comments on that are very much appreciated, because we need that debate in Germany about the future of transatlantic cooperation. It's a question that is always actual, and therefore we had some phases in the German politics where we didn't think about. We take it for granted that America is on our side and that we will increase relations. And we saw that in these phases, maybe it became weaker than we saw it at that time, and now we see the results that are now obvious, looking to that what happened in the election in last November. But talking about that we need a new strategy or something like that, I think this is not the right answer. A strategy you need if you have to overcome problems that are fundamental or principal. I think we can trust on that there is not only between the governments but also between the civil societies a strong binding between Europe and North America, and this is much stronger than some eruptions of the last months or years, and therefore we don't need a new strategy, but we have to overcome the uncertainty, especially on the US side at the moment. We suffer on that uncertainty. I think also US is suffering on that, because if there's uncertainty, there's also the risk of stagnation in every field: politics, economics, social development. And stagnation means that you might fall back compared to others. And therefore, we should overcome this uncertainty. And the second is that I think we should push more to discuss and to take the open, not finished projects on the table. Looking to that, what we started with the negotiations on the trade agreement, for example. We had the EU-US summit, little summit in Brussels in May, end of May, where the US government said, President, that okay, let's start with a working group looking on what is on the table concerning US-EU trade. But there is no execution of the idea to continue those negotiations, maybe just to look what is on the table and what needs to be redefined. This is one of the examples where I say Europe should push more on White House and probably also on the Hill to continue those debates that we already started some years before. We knew that these debates might be difficult. They are probably now more difficult than they were 1 or 2 years before, but that should not mean that we should stop those negotiations. We should continue with those talks and coming closer together by talking that. I think, for example, there was one proposal to say to stop negotiations on trade, because probably the result of the trade negotiations with the Trump administration might be worse than the situation we have now. I think this is not the right answer. We should put that on the table, and I think there will be enough space for improvement, even in trade questions, than probably White House and Brussels sees at the moment.
Okay, I think we will follow up on that. But I think because you just mentioned the question of a U.S. strategy, this was something that my Brookings colleagues were mystified by in the manifesto. They read it and said, "Really, Germany never had a USA strategy? This would be a new thing." Could you perhaps explain to my boss here? I mean, he doesn't believe me, but he might believe you.
Yeah, we have strategies on overcoming the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. We have strategies to how to.
So America is more like Russia and Ukraine.
Trade in China, which political strategies are necessary if you have to solve a fundamental problem. But I think we don't have a fundamental problem with US. We have a situation which is new in some fields, coming from that elections. But we have so much things in common also in the current situation and in the future that we need not a trouble handling strategy.
A trouble handling strategy.
I don't know the English word, but you know what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay. All right. With that, I'm going to move to the chargé. I duly noted that the German transatlantic envoy would like to seize an opportunity in a conversation about multilateral trade. It sure doesn't sound like that when you sit in Washington. But let me put the same question before you. What needs to change now in order to stabilize, preserve, improve the relationship?
It's a great question, a question obviously that many people are grappling with it here, and it's one of the reasons we're excited to be part of this evening, because another transatlantic fellow, but that's really what the bottom line is in this relationship. It's communication. And it's communication that, Mando, come on. But it's truly communication that's needed. That's what our relationship needs. If you have a relationship and you are not tending it, if you're not supporting it, if you're not working on it, the relationship will die. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. So I think you could argue, certainly it has been something, perhaps more of a process, that we've been reinvigorating this relationship and recommitting ourselves to it. And that's important. And that's really what we end up doing here. Sitting in Germany, we don't sit here in Berlin. We try to get out and talk to people. We have generational issues. We have new people who maybe don't know the historical context in which this relationship, how it came to be. We have ways of communicating, whether we're all trying to do this government to government, whether we're talking about our military to military on the security side, whether we're talking about our huge business communities that are both very active in both of our countries, whether we're talking about the thousands of tourists or the thousands of former exchange students who've gone back and forth that we've talked a little bit about. Those are the people, those are the kind of connections that we need, that we continue to need. I was struck a few years ago when my oldest went off to college in the United States, and you talk a lot about exchange programs. And for the first time I realized, wow, it's not like when I went to school and Europe was what Americans did. If you went abroad, you went to Europe. The world is this new generation's oyster, and they see it as the world, not just Europe, not just the United States. So I think it's very important for so much of what we do on the people-to-people side, on the commitment to our publics, that we do have to make it attractive, to have younger people understand how we got here, why we're here, and why this relationship is so important. So that's what I would say needs to change.
So how do you do that?
You continue to work at it. You continue to get people there. You commit yourselves to these exchange programs. You try to find ways, for example, interesting things in the Fulbright program, for example. You've got lots of work on academics and lots of these great exchanges going back and forth, but you start a new diversity program for...
You do realize none of this is controversial.
No. Do I need to be controversial?
No, I'm just thinking that maybe we would edge towards topics, inch slowly, perhaps, if you want, inch slowly towards topics that are actually controversial.
Sure.
I'm sure that Kurt and Jan, at the very least, will do this. But I was hoping that maybe you would sort of stick something out there from your own experience of working here in Berlin. No, trade, defense.
These are, well, you asked
Culture
me. You
wars.
asked me the question. You specifically asked the question, what needed to change in this relationship? There are lots of areas we can talk about. I'm happy to get
All
engaged
right,
in it.
good. Well, we will
Good.
circle back to that. But I also want to, about this brief exchange here about, transatlantic fellows, just one another fellow. Excuse me. I mean, seriously, this is the classical back and forth that you get between diplomats and think tankers. We keep trying to explain to you how important we are so that you can do your work, and then you snob us off and say, it doesn't really matter. We get this in Washington all the time.
I think you misunderstood my joke. It's just people around us say just one more fellow. I think it's really important. Each fellow is more important because it's
I just
what
wanted
we
to
do.
make you say that.
No, I do. I think it's important because if we don't have these new programs, if we don't have new ideas out there to say how can we engage in a different way, how can we keep talking to each other, then we've given up on the relationship.
Actually, we're not as eingebildet as all that, not that hubristic. We're hoping to make a contribution, but God knows, that this current environment is humbling, I think, for all of us, including the think tanks. Kurt, I'm going to move for you. And I was wondering whether you could maybe add a sharper edge to the answers to my question so far. What needs to change now?
Sure.
So that this relationship survives.
Well, first off,
You have an actual napkin. So as a true, diplomat, he has an actual napkin with notes on it. I love it.
So first thing, I agree just what we were saying about fellows programs. We at the McCain Institute, we actually run a fellows program. We do it together with the Bosch Foundation, and it's great, and it's very, very useful. So I do think that matters, and I think that this does matter in terms of the way societies develop, and governments, frankly, do have a lot of hubris, thinking that they're in charge of things, when in fact it's what's going on in the world that's in charge of things, and governments are often reacting to it and dealing with it. So I think getting ahead of that and investing in the right values and investing in the right people is really critical. So congrats to the Bosch Foundation. The thing I would say that needs to change is for everyone to have a little more humility. I think there's a sense of identifying things we don't like, pointing them out, blowing them out of proportion, and thinking that this is terrible and we have to react to this. And really just we're all going through a lot of things. We all have difficult domestic politics. We all have populist movements. We all have publics that are unhappy with elites. We all have issues about the economy and trade and jobs and technology. We all have a lot of anxieties, and we see this in Germany. We see it in France. We see it in Hungary. We see it in the US. We see it in the UK. And these are all things that people are grappling with. And the reality is, our societies, as democracies, as having strong institutions, are actually pretty resilient, and we cope with these things. And whether it's the refugee crisis as it played out in Germany over the last couple of years, or whether it is what I would say is the evolution of expectations about the Trump administration to the execution or the rollout of policy in the Trump administration, is actually better than a lot of people would have thought. So I think let's calm down and not exaggerate differences, and in fact build on the on some of the commonalities that we still have. And here is where I think the authors, Jan, you among them, of that transatlantic letter actually have it right. They have some different analyses as to what's going on with the U.S. and with the transatlantic relationship, but I think their bottom lines are all spot on as to, it is important for Europe, it's important for the United States, we have to invest in these things. We share fundamentally as societies core values, we share core interests, we have to invest in those. So that's what I would say what needs to change, is getting a focus back onto some of the basics and not exaggerating some of the differences and problems beyond what are really there.
So we should all take a transatlantic Ambien
and
sleep over it.
Yes, maybe a melatonin as well.
Yeah, all right. I'm not sure that I'm quite there yet, frankly.
Try one.
Jan, I'm going to pose the same question to you. Yes. And also, do you, after writing the manifesto or reading the Answer in die Zeit, is there anything you've reconsidered?
First, what needs to change? There are all kinds of wishes that we have as think tankers, and our wishes, and that's the great part of being a think tanker, that no matter what you wish or what you say, in the end, you're not responsible for a lot. So it's easy to have wishes. I wish the one thing that could change and needs to change, I think, on our side of the equation, is that we need to think about the transatlantic relationship in a strategic way and not take it for granted any longer. And this is why we put the strategy idea into the manifesto. We said, we need a US strategy for the first time, an official one. And that's basically code for thinking about this relationship as a very precious asset, and not something that's there like oxygen anyways. But something that you need to preserve and work on, and not just at the exchange level and fellows level, which I think is crucial and key, but really think about the strategic situation that we're in and how valuable that relationship is for everything that we do here, including European integration. The U.S. security guarantee, we still rely on it to an extent that most people that I talk to that are not part of this bubble are not fully aware of. And I just had a meeting this afternoon with teachers from the south of Germany who are on some kind of seminar trip here, and I gave a presentation on German responsibility, and you can feel the allergic reaction to pointing out some of the basic tenets of our strategic situation. So, and I think starting with the transatlantic relationship would be one way to establishing a bit of a culture here that understands in what kind of precarious situation we are, and how useful the transatlantic relationship is in stabilizing our situation here.
So you would reassure our American friends by saying that Germany now needs an America strategy doesn't mean we think of Germany in the same way that we think of Russia or China, but rather that this was something that we took for granted and now need to spell out, including to ourselves. And that, in fact, is what I would like to do in the next round of this conversation. But
yeah.
I got you right?
When we say we need a transatlantic strategy, that is not about troubleshooting. A strategy is for your long-term thinking. Troubleshooting is something that you often do ad hoc and kind of improvise. A strategy is about, what do you want out of this relationship over the next 10, 15, 20 years, maybe the next generation even,
Although what I liked about Jürgen Hart's expression of using the word troubleshooting is that it is an implicit admission that we are in a bit of trouble.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, I'm happy to hear after this first round, I have to say, was exceedingly careful in referring to things that we might sort of actually disagree upon. You want to jump in here?
Yeah, I want to jump in concerning strategy. I'm not against strategy or planful action of governments, but maybe if you talk about a strategy process, probably you hide behind that. There's a danger that probably things will not be done because first we have to develop that strategy, then we have to see that is this action fit into the strategy, is reality fitting to the strategy. My experience as politician is that strategies never fit to reality.
Which is why you're negotiating a coalition.
Therefore, I say it's more helpful on the short-term view. It's more helpful to start and to continue those projects that we have already on the street. Looking to that, what we negotiate in trade, for example, with the European Union and USA. That what government says on the campaign trail, President Trump said on trade, doesn't fit to the reality of the trade between Europe and North America or North America and Asia. And talking about what is reality and what can we do better together might help us to overcome the gap between that what is in mind of some citizens and some politicians in Washington, and that what is reality. But if we don't talk about fair trade, we cannot overcome the situation, even not with a good strategy. Yeah? Therefore, I say let's pick up the loose ends and let's continue the talks, and then we will see where we can have progress, where we can come forward, and where not. And then we have to develop strategies where on those fields where we are not able to come forward. But I'm not sure that we are not able to come forward in trade. I'm not sure that we are not able to come forward on burden sharing, but we have to do the debate on the table, and we have to put the facts on the table, and this is what I miss at the moment.
I'm come back to the burden sharing and the trade questions. Although I would note, when one often hears this in Berlin, strategies are a waste of time because they basically, are an excuse for inaction. And it seems to me that if I were going to be nasty, I would apply that same argument to the negotiating of a coalition agreement, which in this instance, as we know, is supposed to take rather longer than usual. I've heard some threats that the government might only be formed in mid-February, which I think is a terrifying thought. But the reality is that there is another advantage to strategy processes and to coalition negotiations, which is that people get to know each other. It doesn't so much matter in the end, I think, what's in the text of a national security strategy or a coalition agreement, but that people sat together around a table, looked each other in the eye and said, what do you want, what do I want? Yeah. And I think the point that your manifesto was making is that we have taken too much for granted and we have to go back to fundamentals to discuss that and not leaving the other stuff out. I do want to do a second round now, though, about to try and dig at that before we come at the actual issues questions, which is that it seems to me that one of the things we have to clarify in this new sort of very disruptive and chaotic environment that we find ourselves in is what do we think, what is our interest in the other? So Jan, tell me, what is our interest in having Europe, in having America present in Europe and interested in Europe and engaged there, if presumably your answer is not going to be, we want them to provide for all of our security so that we can free ride on them?
Yeah. There are several answers to this. The first
maybe one or two for the
beginning. I picked the provocative ones. First of all, I think, one of the... You told us before that we shouldn't make reference to history, and I will break that law now, right here. One of the fundamental lessons that we have learned that Westbindung, our firm embeddedness in the Western family of nations, is a fateful question, not just for our peace with our neighbors, but for peace with ourselves. And the preeminent nation that is the West and stands for the West and can defend the West is the United States. So no matter who is in government, in office there, no matter we like those policies or not, there are two layers that we have to deal with. There are the agenda level items, trade and all of these issues where we've always had disputes. And then there's the underlying level, which is questions of fundamental order in Europe. On the first one, we should have disputes all the time. On the second one, it's actually quite useful if we don't quarrel all the time, but have a certain amount of consensus. And I think this is the fundamental reason why we still need it. We are in a horrible dilemma because we rely on the United States for our external security and defense, and also to a good degree on the United States for the trust infusion that they bring to the European political market.
We also get intelligence, counterterrorism intelligence from them.
For domestic security and the homeland security issues, for sure. And at the same time, there's a growing distrust in whether that security guarantee will hold. So we rely on somebody that we feel now might actually slip away. And that is a situation that we haven't found a recipe for, and for which we need a strategy. What happens if the country that, basically...
We'll get to what we're willing to put into the bargain shortly. That's a separate question, I think. But what I want to hear from you is, I'm assuming that you, like me, would say, yes, we need to do much more to engage the Americans. But I would actually like you to throw at our two American guests an argument of why they ought to remain engaged in Europe. What's their stake here in this current dispensation? We know what it was historically, but what is it now? How do you persuade them to make the deal?
If America's interested in maintaining Pax Americana, this is where Pax Americana is tested probably the hardest way. So if you want to maintain that kind of order for which you stand, you have to actually defend it on the fringes. And here are the fringes. Defend the fringes because that's what everything depends upon. Second thing, this is your geopolitical countercoast. Keep it stable. It's fundamentally important for your own interests. You have a very strong economic investment here. You need to defend this. That sounds banal, but it's actually quite important. Thirdly, what better ally in the world will you find than the Europeans? So you better stay engaged with them. And thirdly, your status as a power, as a global power, is tested in this market. So what happens to your security guarantee here and how the Europeans assess the value of that security agreement will actually be observed, not just by Moscow and Beijing, but also by South Korea and Tokyo. So you're being tested in this market, and it has ramifications way beyond the European market. Those are a few interests, I guess.
I think that's very helpful, actually. I think that's a really important point for Europeans to make in Washington. Over to you, Kurt. Do you find that persuasive? Or is that just a sketch of what might be if we were doing what we ought to be doing?
I come back to thinking that the premises here I don't fully share as to what's the problem here. I think if you're sitting looking at the world as an American and you want to fix a problem, you don't want to do it alone, and you know you need others to do it. And those who are most capable and most sharing the values and able to engage, critical for success, are going to be Europe. And that's the way most things actually play out. You know, that's the way we're doing Ukraine. That's the way we talk about Syria. That's, you know, that's the way things go. So I don't sense the fundamental question here. And so, yes, it's persuasive, and I agree with everything Jan said about, you know, why it's valuable to the U.S. And in fact, that's what we see. In fact, you know, I was thinking on the earlier question, it's not uncommon in the U.S. for in the United States to talk about a European strategy. And the Bush administration had a European strategy, which I could rattle off in 4 bullets. The Obama administration had a European strategy.
Does the Trump administration have one?
I don't know that it has one yet, but I can guarantee you Wes Mitchell is sitting at his desk now thinking of one. So, and I bet you, if you compare these as well, they're pretty much the same thing, too. The strategy is work with Europe on challenges outside of Europe. It's complete the unfinished business of a Europe whole and free, deal with this new Russia challenge, and Turkey creeps in as the fourth one, saying we got to figure out what to do with Turkey. That's kind of the European strategy. It carried the Bush and Obama.
Kurt, this is, I think, where I get rude. How about I propose another articulation of what, if you're sitting in Washington, looks like the administration's Europe strategy, and you tell me whether I've completely lost it. And I will admit that this is to some degree the darkest version of what I think I see, but I will also remind you that some of the so-called adults in the White House have actually undersigned some of this. So it's what I call the triple war narrative: the culture war, the trade war, and the war narrative, in all of which the Europe is a problem and the European Union is an even bigger problem, or something that people like Stephen Bannon has departed, but people like Stephen Miller, and to some degree the president himself, have expressed not just skepticism about, but hostility towards. And it has also not escaped diplomats in Berlin's notice that in many of the articulations, I could also mention the essays of Michael Anton. In many of these articulations, Germany is depicted as the spider in the web, controlling the evil European Union to its own devious designs, including the ECB, which was news to many German diplomats. But, you know, I grant you that some of what was formulated in those things has not come to pass. But I will also remind you of the legendary op-ed by McMaster and Cohn in May, where McMaster said, there is no such thing as, values-based alliances. We're about transactional relationships, and you're going to be, an ally to the extent that it's useful for us in a given moment. We've all read those. They have etched themselves into our brains. How do we unlearn those experiences?
Well, I think first off, on the McMaster op-ed, I can't remember it very well myself, but you're reminding me of it. But what I think they're trying to explain is that it's results-based. We've got to figure out what are we accomplishing, and that's a reasonable thing. I think you're taking the darkest vision of looking at the U.S. right now, and instead, the way I would describe it is you have a president and administration that has come in on the argument that the U.S. was paying disproportionately for the global order. We're paying disproportionately financially, paying disproportionately in lives and conflict, and people wanted to rebalance that. And disproportionately in trade as well, too, if you look at the long-term structural trade deficits. And that causes this angst about jobs and job loss and a recession that even in the recovery didn't produce the rapid growth that people were looking for. So that created the attitudes that are there. And how does that get played out? It gets played out by trying to fix problems. And I think if you go, again, issue by issue or problem by problem, you'll find that the policies that are actually there are reasonable, somewhat more engaged. it occurs to me that the reason you wanted to avoid history is avoid comparisons with the early Obama administration, because here you have
Nice.
Pivoting away from Europe, leading from behind, and the Obama administration changed that over time. And by the last year of the Obama administration, you had a very tough policy on Russia. But remember, it started with a big red reset button. That didn't happen. I think the Trump administration kind of picked up where the Obama administration left off, from the facilities in Maryland to sanctions to a lot of brushbacks on the military side to try to rebalance where we are militarily with Russia. So I think it's very easy to get distracted by the personality and the rhetoric and miss what's actually happening on policy, and where there's actually a lot of common ground and a lot of opportunity to work.
So try and tell us, though, what is exactly America's interest in Europe? What do you need us for?
Okay. I would say at the top of the U.S. global priority list is going to be dealing with North Korea and preventing them from launching nuclear weapons against us. We may have to take some serious actions concerning North Korea. It's going to be stopping Russia's encroachments and rebalancing that. It's going to be defeating global terrorism and ISIS, and then figuring out what happens in Syria and Iraq and the broader Middle East after that. Those are the top three. I think Iran probably follows on that one. And China is maybe more hopeful, but still one where I think the U.S.-European approach to a global order, global economy is going to be important for working with China as China continues to develop itself. I can't think of a single one of those where it's not critical that the U.S. and Europe are working together, whether it's because of the Security Council or because of military capacities or because of multiple relationships, Europe's own business relationships. It extends all the way across, so it's necessary. And I can't think of a single one where we're not actually doing that.
All right. I suspect there will be questions about this later from the audience, but let's try and move to some of these issue areas that have been mentioned. Let's try and do a circle round on foreign and security policy and start off with a subject that I think is currently of most intense concern, and that's North Korea. I have to say that I don't think I have the imagination or the powers of autosuggestion to convince myself that the conversation on North Korea is proving to anything remotely like normalization. If anything, what I see is what our French friends would call a crispation, an increase in tension to the extent of I think giving security professionals the sense that we are on the brink, that we have not talked in such terms, and that senior policymakers in the West and in America have not talked in such terms about the actual possibility of nuclear war. And so, with that preface, I would like to ask you if there is, and if one listens closely enough to American policymakers in Washington, one can hear that that is a possibility. How are you going to sell that in Europe, and how are you going to sell that in Germany, and are you going to ask for a European contribution?
I think and Kurt started, but you've highlighted one of the most serious issues, obviously, that we're all facing right now. And it is something that we've been talking to Europe and European governments, and specifically the German government here at all levels, looking for cooperation, because we do believe it's something that we have to do together. We can't do this alone. We look at a problem that has been intractable for decades. It has not been made you can't really look to something and say there's been great progress anywhere. So part of the strategy, you hesitate to use the word, but the strategy is, of course, to work together with Europe and our Asian allies to put increasing pressure not only on North Korea, frankly, but on China and Russia as well, to really try to squeeze and put the pressure on. And whether you're looking at how we work together with what the German government has done, the German support for this, both within the EU and bilaterally, even in how they deal with their own relationship with North Korea, whether we're talking about the trading issues, whether we're talking about raising this with the Chinese from all different angles, including from the German government. I think that's been something we've worked on very hard. We've also tried to encourage our European allies to go out to other parts of the world, for example, where North Korea has been able to have business as usual. Throughout much of Africa, through much of South Central and East Asia, where maybe there were just operations going on or just a regular old embassy and ambassadors, and trying to get some attention. And I have to say our European allies have been very, very helpful in supporting this idea of we can't do that, we can't have North Korea having a business as usual relationship with countries around the world when there's such a threat to international security.
Hart, what do we do? What leverage do we have to offer, and is it working?
I think it's crystal clear that only a non-military solution can solve that problem. I say not only diplomatic, because the economic pressure needs to be part of that as a non-military but very strong action. It's very important that all 5 permanent members of Security Council are in the loop. It's very important that action is accepted also by China, because if China is not on our side in that question, there will be no solution. And the only answer we can give is that we need something like we had with Iran, a treaty with North Korea on stopping that programs and maybe destroying the installment. And from that point of view, it was not helpful that the US president question marks now the Iran nuclear deal, because this helps not to build up trust in such multilateral UN-supported solutions as Iran nuclear deal is. The only role model for that, what can be done with North Korea to solve that problem, is something similar, or maybe in the direction of that treaty. And if the U.S. government now says it was a bad deal and we don't want to accept that, and the Congress should skip that, this might not encourage people in the government in North Korea, the dictator in North Korea, to step into negotiations as Iran government was forced to do due to the pressure from sanctions they had. And as I wrote today, obviously the sanctions are working, and China is staying to its commitment in that sanction regime, because now we have a shortfall in petrol and other materials in North Korea, more than it was in the last months. Therefore, our proposal is, let's start unique, but maybe a process which needs to be unique, but maybe on the way that we went together with Iran and the others. And US should support that and not question mark this way of dealing with that problem as they do now.
Well, the fact of the matter is, of course, as you keep mentioning the JCPOA, the Iran agreement, and that is, while we are, I think, currently a great deal of bandwidth of diplomacy is currently engaged by the North Korea issue because of the possibility of nuclear war with just stunning consequences for the loss of lives in the Pacific theater, not to mention many other short and long-term implications. But I think to any European, the possibility of actual nuclear war or actual war of that kind is completely terrifying, and I think would, from the vantage point of any German, certainly change the world as we know it. Yeah. Even if what happens is on the other side of the earth. I have frankly, sitting in Washington, I don't get a sense that Europe has a lot of traction on this one. I hope one of you can persuade me otherwise. But let me mention the Iran agreement, because that equally is an area where the agreement in itself, all of us know that what it does is buy us time and make the world not much safer, but a little bit safer. Yeah. Nobody thinks this is a perfect agreement. Nobody in their right minds is unaware of Iran's problematic other activities in terms of supporting regional terrorism, proliferation, and so on. We are all aware of that those issues are not resolved by the agreement. But it's also been, I think, with great justification, hailed as an instance of stellar transatlantic diplomatic cooperation, because despite significant economic and security interests and capability and power differentials between the 6 parties who carried these negotiations to the end, we actually managed to maintain a common position over years and years of negotiation and bring it to an end. And we now have an American administration that fundamentally questions the value of this achievement. That questions the value of transatlantic cooperation in ways that, even if this agreement is not terminated or otherwise called into question, I think has follow-on, knock-on effects damaging the credibility, the legitimacy of the relationship that must, in my view, must concern us now. So I ask you again, what leverage do we have at this point to convince our American partners and friends to not do this? And just to give you an idea of where I'm thinking, what can we do, what can we bring to the table that we haven't brought to the table so far to say we're aware of your concerns and we're willing to do something additional to help deal with that?
First, I trust on the politicians on the Hill, especially on senators, that they will not skip the Iran nuclear deal. And I think it was interesting to see that the president didn't decide to skip it, but handing that over to the Congress.
Yeah.
That means uncertainty for the next few months. This is also maybe a problem, but it's better than the worst case that he would skip that from one day to another. Our dialogue with senators and congressmen is that we want to convince them not to stay to the treaty, because from our point of view, concerning the duties of the treaty, we cannot say that Iran is doing something against the duties of the treaty. They are doing a lot of things against the mind and mood of the treaty, and that what we hope to reach beyond that treaty. But this is not justification, you know what I mean.
It's not a legitimate excuse for abandoning it.
And therefore we say there are good reasons for staying to that treaty. Talking to Israel's, to think tanks in Israel, for example, they also say, generals say, it's better to have the treaty than not to have it. It's not a solution of the problem we have, but it's better than having nothing. And it's one of the examples where, as you mentioned, where a multilateral solution was possible, and the US government is now on the way to maybe looking more to bilateral relations and not trusting in multilateral structures. And with the Iran nuclear deal, there's one example to convince people in the US that also multilateral structures are able to deliver something for benefit for US. Therefore, I think it's a value by itself that the 5 permanent members are staying behind the sanction regime against North Korea. And there's a chance to build up something on that. And we should go that way. But US president should be in the first row to say to the other 4 presidents, I think it's not only presidents, prime ministers and presidents, let's go forward and let's increase pressure on North Korea. And they can trust on that European Union will follow that, not only because 2 of the 5 are members of European Union, but also because European Union and especially Germany have maybe the best diplomatic relations in North Korea. We have the personal contact to members of the government that we can use for building up the first channels to negotiate. And the German government said that we are able and willing to
It's interesting that you're talking to Israeli think tanks. I don't know whether there are any Israeli friends in the audience, but I wonder how much traction Israeli think tanks have with the Israeli government these days. I mean, we know that a lot of senior security figures, retired and current, have said, do not do this to the government, not just the think tanks. And Mr. Netanyahu, I think, is in a different place. He is far closer to the American president on this one. But Jan, I'm going to ask you for an answer to my question, which is, what should Germany put on the table to convince this administration, this White House, that the JCPOA is worth keeping? What is there that we haven't done so far that we should be doing?
I think, first of all, Germany can work towards keeping that European unity that we have seen on this treaty, and thereby signaling to Washington that this is really of prime European interest to keep this thing in place, because that increases the diplomatic cost for Washington to actually abandon the treaty. That's number one. And then there are two additional things that I think we could put on the table, which we haven't really done very seriously. The second one is deliver some kind of concept as to what comes after those 10 years. Because the real lingering question here is, not so much now, because there seems to be fairly decent compliance by, what we read. The question is what happens after those 10 years, when that preliminary phase, that time that we have bought ourselves, runs out. And then the same question comes up again. And then the question comes up again also, how can we increase the price for Tehran if they don't want to go into a continuation? Is there a concept? Is there an idea? What kind of model of order do we want in this question for afterwards? I think if we became a bit more forthcoming on this, that would increase our currency in Washington quite considerably. And the third one is, and you mentioned it very briefly, is the question on do we take Iran's other activities in the region seriously enough? Where in Washington, rightly or wrongly, the impression is that we're too soft on Iran. That we're not really serious about, the financing of terrorism and extremism and all other kinds of minglings and issues where, we turn, our back or, close our eyes and then are not serious enough. Again, that costs us credibility there. And again, that means that you have to have a much more strategic approach to the region, which is so much closer to us than to the US.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move to Russia because I noticed the hands of my watch inching towards the 7:30 mark, and we will go into Q&A. But Kurt, I am going to ask you the biggest fear of Europeans, and not just the Europeans who live in the so-called gray zone, the in-between zone between the outermost eastern border of the EU and the westernmost border of Russia, but Europeans in EU and NATO, is that America and Russia will do a deal over their heads and will, as it were, dispose of the fate of countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and others, or Moldova, and to ask us to accept a fait accompli in spheres of influence. And I think we have some excuses for thinking that the current White House, not all of its tenants, God knows, but perhaps the commander-in-chief might be tempted to think that way. Can you reassure us?
I don't know where you get that from, honestly.
Gosh. Why?
Well, first off, let me say the three biggest fears of Europeans are that, one, we do a deal over their heads; two, we have a war between the U.S. and Russia; or three, that we ignore Europe and walk away and then leave Europe on its own with Russia. So it's like avoiding all three of these is important.
Would be good, yes.
And when you look at Russia right now, there has been nothing, I can't think of a single thing, that would point in the direction of doing a deal with Russia at the expense of Europe on any issue. I just don't see it. In fact, we have one of the worst relationships with Russia that I've ever seen. We are not doing any deals with Russia. They've thrown 700 people out of our embassy in Moscow. We've closed down their consulate in San Francisco. We've maintained the Obama administration's closure of their recreational espionage facilities. We have been working assiduously with Germany, with France, Normandy partners on Ukraine. We have had significant dialogue with Europe on NATO. We've expanded the European Reassurance Initiative, or the NATO name, I guess ERF or something like that. ERP. So we've actually increased the deployments in the Baltic states and Poland. What are you talking about?
I'm fascinated by this.
Yes.
You would like to come in?
I see, in contrary, that there's a U.S. people tell us, and we have to think about, that we probably sell, due to economic reasons, we sell our principles of solidarity in energy questions in Europe, because we didn't face the strategy of Russia to send gas to the rich states in Europe by passing the poorer states, and maybe to make them more dependent on their policy and their energy strategy. Looking to what happened in Europe at the moment, I'm not sure that President knows about, but at the moment we have more US soldiers on German soil than it was under Obama. Yeah. It's a contrary.
Obama did take quite a number of them out.
But it's contrary to that what President Trump mentioned on the campaign trail. He was inaugurated on a day when about 90 U.S. tanks and about 3,000 to 4,000 U.S. soldiers reached Bremerhaven to be moved to Poland. one tank brigade or something like that, which is a significant quantity. Therefore, I also didn't see that risk of the deal with Russia on the shoulders or on our harming us in Europe. The problem with Russia is, I think, much more complicated than maybe some people think, because my theory on that is that Putin is very weak in doing home politics, economics, and 17 years of Putin didn't reach anything for Russia. Tell me the product you want to buy from Russia developed in that country after overcoming the communist system. The state is only driven by that conflict with the Western world. Putin needs that spotlight on the conflict with the Western world, because otherwise maybe people will question mark, what about the development in our country? What did Putin reach? The Emperor Without Clothes is a German fairy tale maybe you know about. Yeah, if someone says what are the clothes of Putin in questions of economic progress in the country, infrastructure, diversification of industry, and so on. Therefore, my theory is that he needs the conflict with us, and if we solve conflicts with Russia, he have to find new conflicts to keep his supporters together in his own country. And this is the problem of every autocrat or dictator, that at the end of in the autumn of his power, he becomes more and more aggressive towards others, because he need that Ablenkung, this distraction from his own problems. And therefore we need a common strategy to help Putin and Russia to come out of that gap. No?
If I could add in, there's lots of years in the former Soviet Union, much of my diplomatic career, it is a constant discussion, no matter who's in government, of the condominium that the U.S. and Russia are going to sit down and resolve X problem. It's always a concern, it's always a worry, even in countries that are not in the middle of a conflict per se, but certainly time in Ukraine, in Georgia, other places that people are very worried about. Part of it's driven by the Russian government, which is always saying, yeah, we're dealing with the European, we want to really deal with the US, we want to make that big decision. And that's not something, I risk going into history here, but historically we haven't done. Since the end of the Soviet Union. We have not sat down to say, let's divide up the world. We've, in fact, explicitly rejected that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'm conscious of the passage of time, so I'm going to end this. I know that we've left tons of questions dangling in the air. I'm doing that deliberately so as to give the audience some options here. I suspect they already have many. But I would like to end by asking all four of you what issue you think we should better not talk about for just so as not to make the relationship deteriorate even further. Remember, your manifesto contained a little list of things that were amenable to transatlantic agreement, some that we ought to just manage because we were going to have to agree to disagree, and some that would be actively damaging to the relationship if we insisted on trying to deal with them. So actually, let me double that. What must we at all costs talk about, even if it's difficult? And what's the one issue that we shouldn't talk about? Jan, I'll start with you. We'll go backwards.
What we must talk about is the credibility of the security guarantee, because it's crucial for both sides, and it's been damaged because the currency of that security guarantee is trust, and no matter, I mean, Kurt pointed to the fact that of course there's a increased troop deployment and more defense spending on the U.S. side on Europe, and yet trust has gone down. So all of that action wasn't enough to counterbalance the words that we've seen, and words do matter in diplomacy because words are deeds. So we must talk about the credibility, and what we shouldn't be talking about, especially on our side, we shouldn't play the schoolmaster on democracy in the United States. We should not, sit here from the moral high horse and lecture the Americans on the dysfunctionality of their own democracy. That is just not going down very well on the other side for very good reasons.
It's also been made slightly more difficult for us to do by the recent elections on September 24th.
That
right?
too, yes.
So, Kurt, how about you?
Well, I can't think of any issue that we shouldn't talk about. I think Jan's right on the one he raised, but maybe it's a question of tone, because we all have, to deal with these issues. One that we absolutely must talk about. It seems like it's difficult to limit it to one.
Well, choose your most important one.
But I suppose what I would do. You have to figure that Russia's the top of the list for U.S. and Europe. That we've got to figure out how do we deal with the challenges that Russia's presenting, but come out of it someplace where we want to be. That's a tough one to figure out. And I think right now we're in a very downward phase of having to push back on Russia in a number of ways, whether it's on the diplomatic front or on Syria or on other things. But that's not where we want to end up. We want to end up with actually having a stable and secure relationship where we can actually build on things that we think are in our mutual interest. And we're not at a point where we can do that right now.
It doesn't seem like that, no. True. Kent, you?
I actually agree completely with Kurt on there's nothing we shouldn't talk about because it's a mature relationship. We should have differences of opinions. We should be in there. I take Jan's point about from how it might hurt the relationship, make it more difficult if we kind of lecture each other. But I think we should be able to talk about everything.
You think we can talk about climate change and the Paris Agreement?
I think we should, yes. And I think we should talk about what the U.S. is doing and what our commitments are, and whether it's on the federal level and how we're engaging in Paris. We'll be there at the COP23, what we'll be doing, or how we're talking about the rest of the U.S. and how it's dealing on various levels with our own performance, which is what the president said very clearly. We should be judged on how we deal with climate change. But what I think we really should talk about is trade. I think trade has to continue to be discussed in a very open and engaging way, taking up Jürgen's first point, not only about discussion of a free trade agreement, which I think there's much support for and interest in as going forward, not perhaps right today, but it's certainly something that the administration has been clear about. But it's also because there are some underlying problems that we have not really been able to engage directly and talk about the real problems. It's easy to say, yeah, we don't need to talk about the trade imbalance, we need to talk about, but we do, and we need to discuss some of those issues, and we really need to get down to brass tacks as to how we can make the situation better. We have too big an investment in both of our countries in both ways on the economic and trade front to just let it go away.
And I think it's probably right, since we didn't have a trained round here, it's probably important also to remind ourselves that this is not just about multilateralism and multilateral organizations versus bilateralism, but also about sort of very specific critiques of Europe versus America and of Europeans by America, such as trade account surpluses, current account surpluses, and so on, where it is actually possible to think of domestic solutions. In fact, things that we might do nationally on our own in a way to attempt to alleviate the issue, and things that in fact might have a beneficial impact on some problems that we're going to try to resolve here in the next legislature. But still, final question to you. What's the most urgent issue, and what should we try and avoid?
I think the most important point is to convince the president and his staff that multilateralism also has a lot of values for the strongest partner, and that bilateralism is probably also for a strong partner or a strong nation not the best way to solve international problems. That we can trust in the power and the strength of bilateral solutions and structures, and that US should be involved in making those structures better and not to blame them for some faults they have or something there where they are not perfect. Then the second is, I agree 100% on you, we should not do schoolmaster towards US citizens and US politicians. It's always the same. If you go into a group of intellectuals in Europe or in US, the first 50 minutes they use about joking about that president, that foolish president, the last mistakes he did, the last Twitters he did, and so on. This is not helpful. This makes probably other people angry, and talking
or makes the president angry.
The president and his supporters, and therefore we should accept that there is Donald Trump as a president, and we should try to convince him that some of his ideas promoted on the campaign trail will not be successful in a reality test, and therefore should be skipped.
All right. Well, I suspect that that issue, particularly of how to assuage the rage against the machine that is out there, I think may return to us in Q&A, but yeah. That is my cue. The floor is yours now for questions. I would ask you to do the following: to introduce yourself and your affiliation, if you can, and you may make a comment or a question, but not both, and both have to be short. Otherwise, I will cut you off. Also, I want to ask Franziska Bauer whether she has questions from social media. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Franziska.
Okay. Yes, I do, actually. So I have two questions from our social media channel. The first one would be: the future of the transatlantic relationship will not be determined by the US and Germany alone. China will be a major factor. What role will Germany play between the two superpowers, and how will that role affect the transatlantic relationship? And the second question would be: what can transatlantic initiatives advance that is of practical value to people on both sides of the Atlantic who are not benefiting from globalization and are disconnected from transatlantic dialogues, but who, as voters, have the power to elect governments toxic to transatlantic values and goals?
Great, thank you. Those are two really good questions. Would anybody like to jump on the role of what Germany should do in mediating in the relationship between America and China?
I will answer with that what the New Zealand Prime Minister told me some months ago. The fact that US government is not willing to continue the debates on trade agreement with the Pacific region will lead to a result that those who trusted on closer relations to North America and Middle America, Central America, now are obliged to think about how to increase the relations to the naturally born biggest trade partner of that region, which is China for New Zealand and Australia. Therefore, in case that we will not have a situation that we can trust on a better trade environment for in the transatlantic region, I think the question will be that we have to think about what can Europe do with Asia to counter that, and therefore it's in the interest of US not to skip the negotiations and the programs, and not to force European nations to find a second best solution, probably with China and others. The first and best solution for increasing our trade to set international standards is the transatlantic approach and not the European Pacific approach, so to say. The second was globalization, and what about the people that are not benefiting of globalization? I think this is one of the big differences between the so-called social market economy in Germany and that what we see as an economic structure in US. In Germany and Europe, maybe not all of the people believe that, but in reality, nearly all are benefiting of globalization. There are only very few really people that really suffers on globalization in Germany. But in US, we have that. We have concrete people, regions, industrial structures that are suffering on globalization because the benefits of globalization are not shared equally over the country, but maybe concentrated on the West Coast and East Coast.
So I have to
and
ask you,
this is something that has to be solved on the national level in US. The economic system of the United States, the economic order of that country maybe needs to be redefined in a way as we did after the Second World War with our Ordnungspolitik and a social market economy. And a social market economy, that the German political and economic system is better able to face the challenges of globalization, and I think with that also the European Union concept than US concept was. And this is one of the reasons why Trump was possible.
Okay, but now I have to ask you on behalf of our American friends, why 12.6% of German voters voted for the AfD then? I think we all know that, in fact, many of us will have seen the exit polls on September 24th, where 84% of respondents said, you know, I'm really happy with Germany's economic situation and my own situation. So this is, in Germany, clearly not an economic issue. Still, we've got 12.6%.
Yeah.
And
but we talk about globalization, which is an economic factor, no?
Yes, but globalization clearly also has identity politics aspects. And clearly these people are angry too, and clearly a lot of these angry people, but not all of them, live in Eastern Germany. I think it would be very helpful for some of our American friends here if you could say why this happened, if it's not economic reasons.
It's difficult to give a short answer, but maybe one insight. People in Eastern Germany were obliged to change totally their life in the beginning of the 90s. Most of them find a way to go through, and most of them, their situation is now better than it was before. But it was a huge challenge for them, and they need a lot of power to handle that, to find a new job with 50 or 55 years old after 35 years in a secure job. And probably those people are tired to do that again. And then they are afraid that probably a new necessity of change is coming towards them, maybe by the refugee crisis and other impacts of globalization. And they probably say, it's only one part of a theory, but they say, oh, not again a total change of my life. I'm tired on that. And probably this is an experience from people in East Germany that might help to explain why probably in a city like Pirna, I was in Pirna 1.5 years ago, talking about refugee crisis with 60 totally angry and afraid, people totally afraid on the situation. And in that time, 13 refugees lived in Pirna, 13. I had 7,000 at that moment in my constituency in Solingen, Remscheid, Wuppertal. The situation in my constituency was totally contrary to that in the region of where Frauke Petri was now elected directly to the Deutsche Bundestag. But the fear was extremely higher than it was. And one part of a theory on that is probably that they have this tiring experience of that they have to change their life totally, and that they want to rest in their situation as it is, and not they are much more afraid of necessity of change than probably people in Western Germany.
Okay, well, there's this famous quote from a reportage about these very violent heckling excursions by the AfD supporters, particularly to Merkel's speeches in the East. Why are you integrating all these refugees? You could try to integrate us first. You haven't tried to integrate me. You look as though you would like to jump in.
I was just on the integration point in the U.S. when I think about globalization, and I think about our campaign, and I think what people need to realize as we go forward is what I think the president figured out how to do was to acknowledge that people weren't being heard in the United States. And that's, again, I go to Jürgen's point, it's true, it's not only economic, it's being left behind, it's a feeling more than only people who didn't make money. There's a very strange, an assumption that often you hear from here is like, oh, those must be those kinds of people who would have voted for the president who were poor or left behind or unhappy. That's not actually what the polls show. We know who voted in different ways as all these studies have come out, and there are a lot of people who've been very unhappy because they didn't feel they were acknowledged, or their concerns or worries, even if they might have a good job, their concerns were acknowledged. And that's something that I think is important as we all go forward, also in Germany, that we have to acknowledge that there are fears. Just as Jürgen said, we have to acknowledge that there's concern, there's worry, and there's some economic hardship as well. Even here in Germany, you'd see it. So it's important, I think, as we go forward. We do both questions again? Do I jump back into China, or do you want to stay on your...
Well, I'm conscious that more people in the audience may have questions, so I don't think I want to let each of you answer both questions unless you absolutely jump at me.
Pass it to Kurt.
May I? Exactly. Then let me go on to the next question. What have we got here? Yes, the gentleman over here.
Thank you. My name is Tomo Pavlov, and I'm a student at the Hardy School of Governance in Berlin. My question is regarding Russia. Can there be unity between the US and Europe regarding the issue with Russia, actually? Because especially after the last round of sanctions that were passed by the US government, it seems like this provoked even Brussels to react against some of the sanctions. So my question is, indeed, can there be unity going to what you proposed, the gentleman from the McCain Institute? Thank you.
I'm going to take your question as well, because I sense it will be about the same topic. But please make it short and wait for the microphone. Over here.
It's not on the same topic. I'm from Donetsk. I'm from Ukraine. I work for deputy of Ukrainian parliament, Sergei Milinchuk. He was fighting Russian aggression in 2014. And my question about new transatlantic strategy. Despite I heard there is new agenda, I know that in 2016 between NATO and European Union signed a joint comprehensive strategy how to combat hybrid threats. And hybrid threats, a new form of war, is really important because after Ukrainian crisis, a lot of member states started rethinking their national security strategy, and also Bratislava summit, we saw serious shifting in national security. I just want to ask you how to protect democracy, because election, referendums, freedom of speech is becoming like a new elements of this modern warfare, also here in Germany, also in Ukraine. And is there a need for a new strategy how to deal with unrecognized countries? Because there's the number of these countries are emerging, and European Union and US trying to say that they are just ignoring them. But it's not about the recognition, it's just about how to deal with them. Thank you.
That is actually, I think, a somewhat related question, because hybrid measures by external powers have an effect on European unity, as we know. But we also know that these things don't just happen on election day. They are present in European politics all the time, so it's a mistake. I mean, it's important to see what happens on election day, but it's a mistake to think that it's over when it's over. So who wants to jump in on this?
Sure. Well, in terms of unity between the U.S. and Europe about Russia, I think yes. I think it is quite possible. We've had that for some time. I think we still have that. Both the U.S. administration and the European Union had concerns about the legislation on sanctions. They were largely the same concerns. They were largely addressed by the reconciliation of the sanctions between the House and the Senate. They mostly dealt with the application of sanctions to European companies that were doing business with Russian entities, and that was largely pulled back. So I do think that's possible. It requires some effort. There are different perspectives sometimes, and different perspectives within Europe. Germany's played a very important role in the European Union of keeping Europe together, but there are different perspectives even within Europe. But I do think it's possible. On hybrid warfare, I think one of the most important things has kind of already happened, which is awareness that this is a form of warfare that has been used and may be used again. And so countries are now much more sensitive to it. They create much more transparency around it. There is an awareness about intelligence, about bribery, about subterfuge, about information. So that gets a lot of exposure now, which was kind of not really recognized when it was happening in Ukraine or other places before that. And then you raised a second point in your question, which is also really interesting, which is the creation of fake entities to justify an occupation, and then say that this is now some new state, you know. And essentially, I think we have to be pretty absolute on this, and that we can't accept that countries can go into another country, break away territory, put up a flag, call it a new state, whether it's Abkhazia or People's Republic of Donetsk, and say that's legitimate. It's just not legitimate. In fact, people have been talking a lot about European security order, and you really don't have to go much further than the Helsinki Accords of 1975 to find the right principles, that they're all there, about refraining from the threat or use of force, non-intervention in internal affairs. Countries have the rights to chart their own security orientation and so on. It's all there. I think we need to kind of have a reaffirmation that these principles are really valid.
All right. I think it's also, helpful. I mean, something that you haven't mentioned that I always think we ought to be able to do more of is following the money trail and exposing corruption related to external actors. And notably, those are not just the Russians. There are some others out there as well, including the Chinese and the Iranians. And that's something where I think Western democracies are noticeably weak.
Yes. And
that has a toxic effect, not just on our on the way we function, but also on our credibility and our legitimacy as Western democracies. Because if we are viable, you know, what's the point?
Yeah. Agree.
Any of you would like to address this? And the question of unity hasn't been answered. Perhaps you might, actually, can I just briefly throw this one over to Jan? Because your book, God, I'm blanking on the title, I'm sorry. The book that you wrote with Leon Mangasarian, Deutschland...
Führungsmacht Deutschland.
Führungsmacht Deutschland, thank you. Go buy it, go read it. And well, they developed this, I think, very helpful notion of servant leadership, which essentially means that Europe's most powerful countries, and yes, one of those would be Germany, need to bring more to the table, need to make more compromises, need to give more to reassure smaller powers that deeper integration or deeper cooperation in Europe does not come only at their expense. So, with that background, can you answer the gentleman's question?
How can we maintain unity on this issue? I'm thankful for this specific example in the context of servant leadership, because it is the one example that we pick in the book to illustrate what that servant leadership means, and where Germany has really actually moved itself into a position of servant leadership in the European and transatlantic context. When the Chancellor, after Crimea and MH17 and then the intrusion into eastern Ukraine, decided that sanctions were an important measure to take, she did a pretty impressive thing, something that no chancellor had really done before her. She stood in front of the Bundestag and declared that, yes, this would be costly for us Germans, but we were willing to pay the price for it because something bigger was at stake, which was European order, the principles that we agreed in Helsinki and reconfirmed later on, that you don't change borders, that if you can't trust these rules anymore, nothing can be trusted any longer. And that rule needed to be maintained, and that Germany was willing to pay. For a country that has always been accused of having business interests first and geopolitical interests second, this was a pretty remarkable step. And of course, the message was not just to Mr. Putin, but it was to the German business community. Don't knock on my door and ask me to, abandon those sanctions because something's bigger at stake than our trade relationship with Russia. And I think that kind of servant leadership so basically exposing yourself and being willing to pay a price for something bigger than your own little interest, that's pretty much the definition of servant leadership. And if we see that also more across the board, then I think, that kind of unity is easier to achieve. It's not the only ingredient that you need for transatlantic unity, but it's a huge building block. And, it was interesting that basically Germany took this position before the traditional foreign policy leaders in Europe, France and Britain, who were kind of out of the game at that time, could take the leadership. And that was a remarkable moment.
This is the high-minded version, and I'm not saying that to be snarky. I think that this is great, and I think that is to a significant extent true. But I would remind us here that in your manifesto, you also say, you mention a case where Germany has actually been quite, I wouldn't say ruthlessly, but determinedly been pursuing its national interests, and that is Nord Stream 2. Do you think that we could maybe sacrifice Nord Stream 2 on the European altar in this next legislature?
When I heard that the German foreign minister was discussing this question and the legal position of the European Union, of the European Commission, together with the President of Russia and some legal experts in a wine dinner evening in St. Petersburg, and no diplomat took any notes of that debate. This is a situation, this is for me totally unacceptable. I never got an answer from the German foreign minister when I asked him in my capacity as foreign affairs spokesman of the CDU-CSU group, when he were informed about the fact that Gerhard Schröder might become a chair of the advisory board of that Russian state-owned company, and that there's a lot of question marks from our partners from North America and also in Europe on what is the German behavior on that question of Nord Stream 2 and others. I can understand. I think the new government has to make clear that we have common energy interests in Europe, that we also have interest that Russia is able to sell us their gas, because otherwise the economy of Russia might be collapsed, and this is also not in interest of everyone in Europe or in the world, but that we stay crystal clear to our obligations in Europe. And the second field is we now start that process of PESCO, of Permanent Structured Cooperation in Defense Policy in the European Union. The German government will decide on that, I think, tomorrow in the cabinet. And then in November, the Council of the European Union will deal with that. There are some people in Germany, probably also from our coalition partners, from our future coalition partners, that think that probably with more European integration of defense, it might become cheaper to defend Europe for Germany. I'm convinced that at the end of the day, it will be more expensive for Germany, because the others trust on us that we are able to invest in that common project, but it will be a significant increase of our security and a significant increase of European role in the transatlantic security framework, and therefore it's a good investment from Germany to do that. And we will see that probably in the next few years, that Germany is doing a more clear way even in the question of energy policy in Europe and in the question of
well, given that we have
defense.
somewhat torturous coalition negotiations ahead of us, we don't know yet which party will own the foreign ministry. But wouldn't it be interesting if it were a Christian Democratic foreign minister? And then we would have to come back with these questions. Anyway,
I'm relatively sure that this will not happen.
All right, we're going to come back to you with that. All right, good to know. Since I don't see anybody waving at me except General Wittmann. Jamie, well, how about waving at me a little earlier? Okay, so 2 questions. I'm going to let General Wittmann, for a change, give the before last question, and Jamie Kirchik gets the last question. I'll take you together, and then we'll do last round, and boom.
I'm last.
Yes, dear. So first, General Wittmann.
Thank you. Klaus Wittmann, Aspen Institute and Potsdam University. If North Korea, as it was said, is the most urgent problem also in European-American cooperation, then I wonder whether our experts on the panel have perhaps any fresh ideas. Are sanctions and pressure everything? Or are there things that one could offer or concede to the North Korean dictator, things he craves, recognition, guarantee against regime change, peace treaty, maneuver activity, and so on. And one second point, since Kurt talked about reaffirming the Helsinki principles, I totally agree. But I note that the one principle which is important for Russia in the Helsinki Final Act is undivided security. And I think we need to think more about what that means.
Well, I think undivided security for Russia means NATO out of Europe, but hey, Jamie.
I'm just going to preface this by saying I'm playing devil's advocate, okay? So there's been a lot of talk tonight about how the U.S. is uncertain. We don't know what the U.S. role will be. And again, playing devil's advocate, is there not maybe a narrative that it could be Germany that has been the weak link on some issues? If we look at the issue of weapons to Ukraine, it was Germany that was standing up against sending weapons to Ukraine, while Eastern European countries wanted to send weapons to Ukraine, and now it appears that the U.S. will be doing that. If you look at Iran, there's a perception, I'm not saying it's accurate, but there's a perception in the United States that German business interests often take precedence over the security concerns about weapons development. If you look at NATO, yes, Donald Trump said all these awful things about NATO, but it's Germany that's not paying 2%. The state of the German military is not where it should be. And then finally on Russia, again, the things that Donald Trump said during the campaign were abhorrent, but as Kurt said, we're 9 months into this administration without a real major shift in policy. And it could be argued that for the past couple of years, the real weak link in terms of the transatlantic relationship in Russia has been the Social Democratic Party in this country. So that's just another narrative to explore, and just curious what people think.
All right, so several grenades have been lobbed at us, but it is 8 p.m. So I am going to go again around the panel and give you a minute each to, and you've got a minute, so try not to answer all the questions because you'll be completely incoherent. You can choose one. I suggest you choose one and answer it and take a minute for it.
To Jamie's devil's advocate question, much of that narrative you can find in the book, that we published, Leon and myself, as a criticism vis-a-vis Germany. The ball is very much in our court here to perform more, to do more, to expose ourselves more. You can still argue about, whether weapons delivery to Ukraine is a great thing or not. The question is that you need to think at that strategic level and make that kind of your default strategic culture, which often in this country, I think, still is underdeveloped. So, defense spending, quite clearly. I mean, we have reformed our armed forces to death in the last 25 years. They're barely usable, and we're underspending, and spending 2% would probably be required to get back to make those things that we actually do own useful. and would not give us too much in excess of that. So I agree. I mean, there is certainly a role to play for Germany in this, and I think we need to be a lot more self-critical about our role in this. That would probably warrant another seminar here. The same applies to the European context, by the way. It's not just its security and defense context, but also within the EU we have underperformed as the reserve power for integration and for the euro specifically, and all of that is going to backfire.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be very quick, but on North Korea, we've tried that a lot. And Klaus, I don't mean to sound like I'm disagreeing with you on the points that you raised, because I agree with most things that we talk about, but on these two, I do. I think that on North Korea, we've tried many times, multiple administrations, to work out what we can do for North Korea to get out of this, and they keep building nuclear weapons and keep testing them, and more rockets and more distance, and we're really at a critical point. The undivided security. I think undivided security is when Georgia's security is as important as Russia's security, or Ukraine's security is as important as Russia's security. Right now, there aren't any foreign troops on Russian soil. There isn't any fighting going on Russian soil. Only Russian forces on the territory of other countries. So I think that is the fundamental point about undivided security. No one is threatening Russia, no one's fighting them, but we've got to restore that sense of genuine security for all. There's no second-class status for some of these East European countries. And finally, I'm reminded, since we're doing our closing round, I was here on election night in Berlin, and was across town, something Aspen organized. And I was thinking about, I was being asked, what to make of the Trump election. And I wrote down the points I made then, I would repeat again today. And I'd say it applies equally to the United States as to our friends in Europe. Our advice to ourselves: don't make any assumptions, don't lecture, do your homework, and be a problem solver. And I think that's still good advice. If we in the United States take that approach, or if our European allies take that, we'll actually get along just fine.
Excellent. Thank you for those cheerful words.
Yeah, cheerful. Close them out very well. But going back to the devil's advocate positions, I actually think that's a lot of what we do sitting here in the embassy in our mission Germany, trying to explain exactly how people in the United States, and not just people who support the administration, also people who question the administration, have exactly those points in mind. And I'm constantly surprised when people are surprised when we make that point. If you describe not necessarily the argument about whether 2% in the military and what needs to happen here in Germany, but if you also say, I got to tell you, my relatives in Kansas say 2%, they don't pay 2% because they have to have free healthcare and free education for their kids. And but that's what people think. And you have to actually go and say, I'm not arguing that's what is the reality, but it is the kind of gulf that we do have in our populations that we all need to work a little bit better on to show what the real situations are. But it is important, I think, for people here to understand at least what many Americans, these assumptions that you rightly raise, or these narratives, while not at all true necessarily, are certainly in the public mind. So it's important to remember.
All right. Last word to you, Erhard.
Just two short quotes. The toughest debate on the 2% goal in the campaign, the German national election campaign, was from the Social Democrats. Interesting to hear. It was Frank-Walter Steinmeier as foreign minister signing that Wales paper. By the way, it was Joschka Fischer from the Greens signing the Prague paper of 2% in 2002 as foreign minister. Therefore, I'm convinced that with our probably new partners, that as you saw today in the Deutsche Bundestag, the block in the center, that we find an answer on that also is helpful for our transatlantic relations. Second, concerning North Korea, I think the direct influence on the North Korean government is difficult to do more than we do now, but probably to have some incentives for the Chinese government to push on the North Korean government. Probably we can think about what is in for China if China helps us to solve that problem, not only with economic sanctions, but also with political pressure to take out the Stecker, the plug of that that dictator in North Korea. Probably there's a chance to come forward. But I'm not 100%.
This is actually kind of a cliffhanger thing to say, pulling out the plug of the dictator. But nonetheless, this is where we stop. This is where we stop. I have to say, I think you four made this very interesting, and that's not going to make me overcome my fundamental reservations about Manels. But I am going to thank you all the same. Please help me thank them. And thank you to Bosch for hosting us. Thank you for Brookings and Bosch for this partnership, which made my position possible and then made you choose me. So I'm the one who really needs to thank everybody here. So wonderful, and I hope we have a lot more of this in the weeks and months and years to come. So thanks.
Thank you.